strange historians.
You find yourself standing in the shadows of a crumbling villa outside Rome, with dawn's light barely penetrating the morning mist on June 9th, 68 AD. The air hangs thick with the stench of fear and desperation. Through the half-rotted wooden door, you hear the most powerful man in the known world, a man who once commanded legions, who burned cities for entertainment, who murdered his own mother sobbing like a frightened child. His voice, once trained to fill amphitheaters with melodic performances, now cracks and trembles as he mutters the same phrase over and over: Quolus, artifex, perio, what an artist dies in me. This is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the 5th Emperor of Rome, in his final pathetic hours. The man who kicked his pregnant wife to death, who castrated a boy to replace her, who watched Rome burn while composing poetry about Troy. This monster is about to die, not in glorious battle, not surrounded by loyal guards, but cowering in a freedman's hovel, too cowardly to even drive the blade into his own throat. To understand how the most powerful man on earth came to this miserable end, we must go back to where it all began, in the poisoned halls of imperial power, where a teenage sociopath first tasted blood, before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. On December 15th, 37 AD, a child is born in the seaside town of Antium. As the first rays of dawn touch his skin, an omen that ancient Romans would later claim foretold his fiery nature. But Lucius Domitius, Ahenobarbus, as he was first called, came into this world already stained with the blood of generations. His family tree reads like a catalogue of violence and cruelty stretching back centuries. His great-great-grandfather had ridden through Gaul on an elephant, displaying the severed heads of enemies like trophies. His grandfather gouged out a Roman knight's eye in the forum for the crime of speaking against him. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man so vicious that when friends congratulated him on his son's birth, he replied with cold honesty, "Nothing that was not abominable and a public bane could be born of Agrippina and myself." How prophetic those words would prove. The boy's mother, Agrippina the younger, was perhaps the most dangerous woman in Rome's sister to Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. She possessed the lethal combination of imperial blood and ruthless ambition. She had already been exiled once for plotting against her brother, had already buried one husband under suspicious circumstances, and was already scheming to place her son on the throne of the world. When little Lucius was only 3 years old, his father died. Some whispered of poison, though others claimed dropsy finally claimed the brute. The boy inherited a third of his father's estate, but even this pittance was stolen when Emperor Caligula seized all the family's wealth. Agrippina was banished to a barren island, and the child was left in the care of his aunt Lepida with nothing but 2 servants, dancer and a barber, hardly the tutors fit for a future emperor. But Agrippina was not a woman to accept defeat. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, and her uncle Claudius stumbled onto the throne, she seduced her way back to power. First, she married Gaius Sallustius Passinus Crispus, one of the richest men in Rome, who conveniently died soon after their wedding, leaving her his fortune. Then she set her sights on the ultimate prize, the emperor himself. Claudius already had a wife, Messalina, a woman whose sexual appetites were legendary even by Roman standards. But Messalina made the fatal mistake of going through a marriage ceremony with her lover, Gaius Silius, while still married to the emperor. Whether it was a drunken folly or an actual coup attempt, it gave Agrippina the opening she needed. Messalina was executed, and Agrippina moved in for the kill. Picture the scene: the Emperor Claudius, a stammering, drooling man in his 60s, completely bewitched by his beautiful niece. Roman law forbade marriage between uncle and niece, but when your emperor laws are merely suggestions. In 49 AD, 12-year-old Lucius watched his mother become Empress of Rome, and with that union, his path to ultimate power was set. Agrippina wasted no time. She convinced Claudius to adopt her son, and the boy's name was changed to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. At 13, he was given the toga of manhood. At 14, he was proclaimed heir to the throne, taking precedence over Claudius' own son, Britannicus. At 15, he married Claudius' daughter, Octavia, making him not just heir but son-in-law to the emperor. But Agrippina was impatient. In October of 54 AD, Emperor Claudius sat down to dinner and never rose again. The official cause was a stomach ailment brought on by mushrooms, but everyone in Rome knew the truth. Agrippina had finally tired of waiting and fed her husband a dish of poisoned mushrooms. His favorite food turned into his last meal. Some accounts suggest that when the first dose wasn't quite enough, she enlisted the help of a woman named Locusta, a professional poisoner who finished the job with a feather dipped in toxin thrust down the emperor's throat under the pretense of helping him vomit. Claudius died in agony, his body convulsing as the poison ate away at his insides. At 17 years old, Nero became master of the known world. The early signs were promising, or so they seemed. The young emperor's first acts appeared to show mercy and wisdom when asked to sign a death warrant, daily routine for Roman emperors. He famously said, "How I wish I had never learned to write." He reduced taxes, gave generous gifts to the people, and promised to rule according to the example of Augustus. But those closest to him saw the cracks in the facade. His tutor Seneca would later write that he dreamed of teaching Caligula again, a nightmare that proved prophetic. For while Nero spoke of mercy in public, in private he was already planning his first murder. The target was his stepbrother Britannicus, Claudius' biological son and therefore a potential rival for the throne. Britannicus was only 14, a quiet boy who had never shown any ambition for power. But in Nero's paranoid mind, his very existence was a threat. The murder was planned with meticulous care. It happened during a dinner party in the palace, surrounded by the elite of Roman society. Britannicus called for his wine to be cooled with water, a common practice. But the water had been treated with poison by Locusta, the same woman who had helped kill Claudius. As the gathered guests watched in horror, the boy took a sip and immediately began convulsing. His face turned blue, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor. His young body racked with spasms as the poison burned through his veins. Nero continued eating calmly, remarking to the shocked dinner guests that it was merely an epileptic fit. Britannicus was known to suffer from them. The boy died within minutes, foam pouring from his mouth, his limbs twisted in a final rictus of agony. Nero ordered the body removed and the dinner to continue. When someone suggested calling for a doctor, the emperor replied with cold indifference, "There's no need, he's just having one of his fits." But this was only the beginning. The monster was just learning to taste blood. For the first few years of his reign, Nero was held in check by three powerful advisors: his mother, Agrippina, his tutor, Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect, Burrus. This trio, later called the Good Influences, managed to restrain the worst of his impulses. Under their guidance, the empire experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. But Agrippina had not orchestrated her son's rise to power only to see him controlled by others. She had tasted ultimate power as the mother of the emperor, and she was not about to let it slip away. She began making demands, insisting on being consulted on all state business, demanding to sit beside Nero during official ceremonies, even suggesting that she should have her image on Roman coins alongside her son's. Nero chafed under his mother's control. The teenage emperor wanted to enjoy the pleasures of power without the burden of responsibility. He wanted to race chariots, perform on stage, and sleep with whomever he pleased, activities that his mother considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. The breaking point came when Nero fell in love with Poppaea Sabina, the wife of his friend Marcus Salvius Otho. Poppaea was everything Agrippina was not: young, beautiful, sensual, and completely amoral. She whispered poison in Nero's ear, telling him that he was not truly emperor as long as his mother controlled him, that he was nothing but Agrippina's puppet. Agrippina, sensing the threat, fought back with the only weapons she had left. She began supporting Britannicus openly, hinting that perhaps she had made a mistake in choosing Nero over Claudius' biological son. It was a fatal miscalculation. The young emperor decided that his mother had to die, but killing Agrippina would not be simple. She was popular with the people, beloved by the army, and protected by loyal guards. Worse, she had survived so many assassination attempts over the years that she had become paranoid about poison, employing food tasters and antidote specialists. Nero needed a method that would appear accidental. His first attempt was an engineering marvel of murderous ingenuity. He commissioned a special boat to be built for his mother, one with a collapsible cabin roof designed to crush its occupants, while making the death appear to be a tragic accident at sea. The plan was to invite Agrippina to a festival at Baia, load her onto the boat for the return journey, and activate the mechanism once they were far from shore. On the night of the festival, March 23rd, 59 AD, Agrippina was in high spirits. She believed her son was finally showing her the respect she deserved, treating her like the empress mother she had always seen herself as. She boarded the boat with her friend Acerronia and a few servants, completely unaware that she was stepping into an elaborate death trap. As the boat moved into deeper water, the mechanism was triggered. The cabin roof, weighted with lead, came crashing down with a thunderous crack. But the plan went horribly wrong. Instead of crushing Agrippina, the falling debris killed Acerronia instead. Agrippina, showing the survival instincts that had kept her alive through decades of imperial intrigue, threw herself overboard into the dark waters of the bay. She was an excellent swimmer, a skill that now saved her life. As the boat's crew tried to finish her off with oars and boat hooks, she swam toward shore in the darkness, her heavy robes dragging her down, but her will to live keeping her afloat. She could hear them shouting behind her, cursing as they searched the black water for any sign of movement. Somehow she made it to shore. Somehow, this woman who had survived the madness of Caligula, the paranoia of Claudius, and now the murderous rage of her own son, pulled herself from the water and staggered to safety. When word reached Nero that his mother had survived, the young emperor flew into a panic. There could be no pretense of accident now. Agrippina knew exactly who had tried to kill her, and she would not remain silent. He had perhaps hours before she rallied her supporters and struck back. Nero turned to Anicetus, admiral of the fleet at Misnum, and the man who had designed the boat trap. "Finish it," he ordered. "Kill her tonight." Anicetus and a squad of soldiers surrounded Agrippina's villa as she tried to rally her forces. They found her in her bedroom, still dripping with seawater, trying to send messages to her allies. When she saw the armed men burst through her door, she knew her time had come. But Agrippina faced her death with the dignity that had defined her life. She stood tall, looked her killers in the eye, and spoke her final words: "Strike my womb. First, let them drive their swords into the body that bore such a monster." The soldiers hesitated for a moment. This was not some helpless victim, but the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, the mother of their emperor. But orders were orders. The blades fell again and again, hacking through flesh and bone until Agrippina, the younger, the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire, lay dead in a pool of her own blood. When Nero received confirmation that his mother was dead, his first emotion was not grief or guilt, but relief. The woman who had made him emperor and then tried to control him was finally gone. He was truly free to rule as he wished, but the matricide would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Roman people might have accepted the murder of a political rival, but killing one's own mother violated the most sacred bonds of family and religion. Rumors spread like wildfire through the city. Nero had not only murdered his mother, but had forced his way into her bedroom afterward to gloat over her naked corpse, examining her body and commenting on which parts were beautiful and which were flawed. Whether or not this ghoulish tale was true, it captured something essential about the monster Nero was becoming. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed an act so unnatural that it transformed him from a cruel young man into something barely human. And the worst was yet to come. With Agrippina dead and his other advisors losing influence, Nero was free to indulge his every whim and appetite. He threw himself into the pursuit of pleasure with the same intensity that he had once applied to murder. He raced chariots and private circuits, performed on stage to carefully selected audiences, and engaged in sexual escapades that shocked even the jaded aristocrats of Rome. His marriage to Octavia, Claudius' daughter, had always been political, rather than passionate. She was a quiet, virtuous woman who represented everything Nero found boring about traditional Roman values. He preferred the company of Papagei, Sabina, who had finally convinced her husband Otho to divorce her so she could pursue the emperor. Openly, Papagei was everything Octavia was not: ambitious, manipulative, and completely without moral constraints. She understood that power was the ultimate aphrodisiac and wielded her sexual influence over Nero like a weapon. Under her guidance, the emperor began to see murder not as a necessity, but as entertainment. The first to die was Marcus Junius, a descendant of Augustus who had committed no crime other than having imperial blood in his veins. Nero had him poisoned simply because his lineage made him a potential rival. Next came Rubellius Plautus, another member of the imperial family, who was executed on the flimsiest of pretexts. But Nero's appetite for blood was growing, and soon even members of his inner circle were not safe. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect who had helped guide him through his early years, died under suspicious circumstances, officially of throat cancer, though many suspected poison. With Burrus gone, Seneca's position became untenable, and the old philosopher was forced into retirement. By 62 AD, 5 years into his reign, Nero had eliminated everyone who might have restrained him. He was answerable to no one, feared by all, and drunk on the intoxicating power of life and death over millions of people. It was then that he decided Octavia had to go. The empress had done nothing wrong except fail to provide an heir and stand in the way of Nero's obsession with Papaya. But in Nero's mind, these were crimes worthy of death. The problem was that Octavia was popular with the people, who saw her as a link to the beloved Claudius and a symbol of traditional Roman virtue. Nero tried divorce first, claiming the marriage was invalid because they were too closely related. When that failed to satisfy public opinion, he accused Octavia of adultery with various men, including slaves. Under torture, her alleged lovers confessed to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear, their screams echoing through the imperial dungeons. But the Roman people refused to accept these obvious fabrications. When Nero announced his intention to marry Papaya, riots broke out in the streets. Crowds surrounded the palace, demanding that Octavia be restored as empress. Statues of Papaya were torn down and dragged through the mud, while images of Octavia were crowned with flowers. For a moment, Nero wavered. The riots reminded him that for all his power, he still depended on the support of the people. He briefly took Octavia back, allowing her to return to the palace while Papaya was quietly moved to a villa outside the city. But Papaya was not a woman to accept defeat gracefully. She knew that her entire future depended on becoming empress, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. She convinced Nero that the riots were proof of a broader conspiracy, that Octavia was secretly plotting against him, and that only her death could ensure his safety. The emperor needed little convincing. He had Octavia arrested on charges of treason and adultery, then shipped off to the island of Pandateria, the same place where her grandmother, Julia, had died in exile decades earlier. But exile was not enough for Nero's paranoid mind. Within days, he ordered her execution. Octavia was only 20 years old when the soldiers came for her. She had spent her entire life as a pawn in other people's political games, married off as a child to secure alliances, divorced and remarried at the whim of her stepbrother husband. Now, as she faced her final moments, she showed a dignity that had been absent from her short life. The soldiers bound her hands and opened her veins, letting her blood drain slowly into the floor of her prison cell. It was a merciful form of execution, no cross, no beheading, just a gradual slide into unconsciousness as her life ebbed away. She died calling out the names of her father Claudius and her murdered stepbrother Britannicus. Her last words, a prayer that their spirits would welcome her into whatever lay beyond. Her head was cut off and brought to Rome as proof of her death, presented to Papaya like a grotesque wedding gift. The woman who had dreamed of being empress gazed upon the severed head of her predecessor and smiled with satisfaction. 12 days later, Nero and Papaya were married in a lavish ceremony that cost more than most provinces generated in a year. The palace was decorated with gold and precious stones, the wine flowed like water, and the emperor performed a special song he had composed for the occasion. Rome now had a new empress, one who had climbed to the throne over the corpses of everyone who stood in her way. But even as Nero celebrated his new marriage, darker forces were at work. The monster he had become was not satisfied with simple murder. He craved spectacle, drama, and the kind of destruction that would echo through history. Soon, Rome itself would burn. The Great Fire of Rome began on the night of July 18th, 64 AD, in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus. It started small, perhaps an overturned oil lamp, maybe a cooking fire left unattended, but the summer had been dry. The wooden buildings were tinder-ready, and the wind was strong. What began as a minor blaze quickly became an inferno that would consume 3/4 of the city for 6 days and 7 nights. The fire raged through Rome's crowded districts. The flames leaped from building to building faster than people could flee, turning the narrow streets into death traps filled with smoke and falling debris. The lucky ones made it to the Campus Martis, or the gardens of the rich, huddling together as they watched their city burn. The unlucky ones were consumed by the flames, their screams lost in the roar of the conflagration. Ancient sources disagree about where Nero was when the fire started. Some claim he was in Antium, his birthplace, and rushed back to Rome as soon as he heard the news. Others place him in the city from the beginning, organizing relief efforts and opening his own palace to refugees. But the most persistent and damning account comes from Tacitus, who suggests that while Rome burned, Nero saw an opportunity. According to this version, as the flames devoured the city, Nero climbed to a high tower and began to sing. His song was the Iliad of Homer, the ancient tale of Troy's destruction, and he performed it with all the dramatic passion he brought to the stage. While his subjects fled for their lives, while children burned alive in collapsing buildings, while 1,000 years of Roman history went up in smoke, their emperor treated the greatest disaster in the city's history as inspiration for his art. Whether this account is literally true or not, it captures something essential about Nero's character. Here was a man so divorced from human feeling, so intoxicated by his own sense of artistic grandeur, that he could find beauty in unimaginable suffering. The destruction of Rome was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a spectacle to be savored. When the fire finally burned itself out, the devastation was almost total. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained intact. The rest was ash and rubble, a moonscape of destruction stretching for miles. Hundreds of thousands of people were homeless, their possessions destroyed, their livelihoods gone. The dead numbered in the thousands, many burned beyond recognition, their bodies adding to the stench that hung over the ruined city like a shroud. But for Nero, the fire was not a disaster, it was an opportunity. Even as the ashes were still warm, Nero was walking through the ruins with his architects, sketching plans for a new Rome that would dwarf anything the ancient world had ever seen. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and it would be his masterpiece, a palace complex so vast and opulent that it would cover nearly 1/3 of the city. Picture the scale of Nero's megalomania, a palace that stretched from the Palatine Hill to the Esquiline, encompassing 300 acres of prime Roman real estate. The main dining hall was circular and rotated constantly, day and night, mimicking the motion of the heavens. The walls were covered in gold leaf and precious gems, the ceilings decorated with ivory and mother-of-pearl that caught the light like captured stars. Artificial lakes were dug where neighborhoods once stood, and in the center of it all rose a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself. 120 feet tall, its face turned toward the sun in eternal glory. But the true obscenity was not the palace's size or cost, it was the speed with which construction began. Bodies were still being pulled from the rubble when Nero's workers started tearing down the remaining structures to make room for his pleasure dome. Families who had lost everything in the fire watched in horror as their former neighborhoods were transformed into gardens for the emperor's amusement. The people began to whisper that the fire had been no accident. They remembered how quickly Nero had moved to seize the burned land, how eager he seemed to begin his grandiose building project. Rumors spread like wildfire through the refugee camps. Nero had ordered the fire set, they said. He had watched Rome burn because he wanted to rebuild it in his own image. Nero heard these whispers and knew he needed a scapegoat. His solution was as calculated as it was cruel. He would blame the Christians. This strange new cult from the eastern provinces made perfect targets. They were foreign, they worshipped a crucified criminal as a god, and they spoke constantly of the world ending in fire. Most Romans found their beliefs bizarre and threatening, making them ideal villains for Nero's purposes. The persecution that followed was a masterpiece of sadistic theater. Nero didn't simply execute the Christians. He turned their deaths into entertainment for the masses. In his private gardens, he had them covered in pitch and set ablaze as human torches to light. His evening parties, the screams of the burning victims provided a soundtrack for the emperor's recitations of poetry, their writhing bodies casting dancing shadows on the faces of his dinner guests. Others were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs, torn apart while the crowd cheered. Still others were crucified in elaborate tableaus, sometimes dressed as mythological figures to add an artistic element to their suffering. Nero himself often directed these spectacles, positioning the victims for maximum visual impact, adjusting the lighting, critiquing the performances, like a theater director staging a particularly challenging play. But even as he fed Christians to the flames, Nero's appetite for destruction was growing beyond anything Rome had ever seen. The monster was evolving, becoming something that transcended mere cruelty and approached the realm of madness. It was during this period that he committed what many considered his most shocking crime yet: the murder of his pregnant wife. By 65 AD, Poppaea was carrying Nero's child, a daughter they would name Claudia Augusta. For a brief moment, it seemed that becoming a father might humanize the emperor. He doted on Poppaea during her pregnancy, showering her with gifts and attention. When their daughter was born, he declared public holidays and ordered celebrations throughout the empire. But Claudia Augusta lived only for months before succumbing to illness, and her death sent Nero spiraling into a rage that would cost Poppaea her life. The exact circumstances of Poppaea's death vary depending on which ancient source you believe, but all agree on the basic facts. She was pregnant again when she died, and Nero was responsible. Suetonius provides the most damning account, claiming that the emperor kicked his wife in the abdomen during a violent argument about his obsession with chariot racing. Picture the scene: Poppaea, heavy with child, confronting her husband about his latest excess. Perhaps she had grown tired of playing second fiddle to his horses and gladiators. Perhaps she had finally realized that the man she had manipulated into marriage was beyond any woman's control. The argument escalated, voices rising in the palace corridors, until Nero, this man who commanded legions, who could execute senators with a word, lost his temper completely and lashed out at the one person who had dared to criticize him. The kick landed squarely in her swollen belly. Poppaea doubled over in agony, her hands clutching her stomach as blood began to flow down her legs. She tried to speak, but the pain overwhelmed her, and she collapsed to the marble floor, her unborn child dying inside her as she bled out in front of her husband. Nero stood over her body, watching the life drain from the woman who had helped him murder his way to absolute power. There was no remorse in his eyes, No recognition of what he had done, only irritation that she had dared to oppose him. He called for slaves to clean up the mess and went back to planning his next chariot race. But losing Papaya left a void in Nero's life that he didn't know how to fill. She had been more than a wife. She had been his partner in crime, his accomplice in murder, the one person who truly understood his capacity for evil. Without her, he felt incomplete, lost, desperate to find someone who could replace what he had destroyed. It was then that he noticed Sporus. The boy was perhaps 13 or 14 years old, a slave in the imperial household who bore a striking resemblance to Papaya. He had the same delicate features, the same golden hair, the same graceful way of moving that had first attracted Nero to his dead wife. In the emperor's twisted mind, a plan began to form, a plan so depraved that it would shock even the jaded aristocrats of Rome. Nero ordered that Sporus be brought to him privately. The boy had no idea what was about to happen, no understanding of the fate that awaited him. He knelt before the emperor, probably expecting to be given some minor household duty, or perhaps to be sold to another master. Instead, Nero announced that Sporus would be castrated. The operation was performed by the imperial physician's men, who had sworn oaths to heal, but who dared not disobey their emperor's commands. They held the struggling boy down while a heated blade removed his manhood, his screams echoing through the palace corridors as Nero watched with satisfaction. The emperor wanted to ensure that Sporus could never develop into a man, that he would remain forever trapped in the feminine form that reminded Nero of his murdered wife. But castration was only the beginning of Sporus's torment. As the boy recovered from his mutilation, Nero had him dressed in women's clothing, his hair styled in the fashion of an empress, his face painted with cosmetics to enhance his resemblance to Papaya. Teachers were brought in to instruct him in feminine deportment, to teach him how to walk and speak and gesture like a woman. When the transformation was complete, Nero announced that he would marry Sporus in a formal ceremony. The wedding was a grotesque parody of Roman tradition. Sporus was dressed in a bride's veil and gown, his castrated body perfumed and adorned with jewelry. A dowry was formally presented, contracts were signed, and the traditional rituals were performed while the assembled nobles watched in horrified silence. No one dared to object. No one risked the emperor's wrath by pointing out the obscenity of what they were witnessing. After the ceremony, Nero began referring to Sporus as his wife, demanding that others in the court address the boy as empress. He had a special litter constructed so that they could appear together in public. The emperor and his bride touring Rome while the people stared in disbelief at what their ruler had become. But Nero's cruelty toward Sporus went beyond the public humiliation. In private, he subjected the boy to sexual abuse that would have been shocking even by the standards of a society that routinely exploited slaves. Sporus was forced to play the role of Papaya in Nero's twisted fantasies, enduring whatever perversions the emperor's mind could devise. The boy's suffering was made worse by the knowledge that he could never escape. Castrated and feminized, he was neither man nor woman, but something in between, a creature that existed solely for Nero's pleasure. He had no allies, no protectors, no hope of rescue. His only choice was to submit to whatever torments the emperor inflicted upon him, or face an even worse death. Meanwhile, Nero's reign of terror was expanding beyond the palace walls. The emperor had developed a taste for forcing nobles to participate in degrading spectacles, compelling senators and knights to fight as gladiators or perform on stage like common actors. These men, who had spent their lives building careers and reputations, were reduced to entertainment for Nero's amusement. Some tried to resist. Marcus Junius Silenus chose suicide rather than submit to Nero's demands. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the emperor's former tutor, also took his own life when ordered to do so, opening his veins in a bathtub while dictating his final thoughts to a scribe. But for every noble who chose death over dishonor, dozens more submitted to whatever humiliation Nero demanded. The emperor's nighttime wanderings through Rome became legendary for their violence and depravity. Disguised in common clothes, Nero would roam the streets with a gang of fellow aristocrats, attacking random citizens for sport. They would beat shopkeepers, rape women, rob travelers, and sometimes kill for no reason other than entertainment. When victims tried to fight back, they often found themselves facing treason charges the next day. Their resistance to an unknown attacker retroactively transformed into an assault on the emperor himself. But perhaps Nero's most shocking innovation was the dinner party that lasted from sunset to dawn, during which guests were encouraged to indulge every possible vice. These gatherings featured not just excessive food and drink, but elaborate sexual performances, torture exhibitions, and sometimes live executions for entertainment. Wealthy Romans who wanted to stay in the emperor's good graces felt compelled to attend these orgies, bringing their wives and daughters to participate in whatever degradations Nero devised. The emperor himself often performed at these gatherings, singing while naked slaves were tortured or playing his lyre while prisoners were fed to wild animals. He had developed a theory that art was enhanced by the presence of real suffering. Music sounded sweeter when accompanied by genuine screams of pain. As word of these excesses spread throughout the empire, Nero's support began to erode even among those who had initially welcomed his rule. The armies stationed far from Rome heard disturbing reports about their emperor's behavior. Provincial governors, who had once sent flattering letters to the capital, began to distance themselves from the regime. Even the Praetorian Guard, supposedly the emperor's most loyal supporters, started to grumble about the man they were sworn to protect. But Nero was oblivious to the growing discontent. Drunk on power and convinced of his own artistic genius, he believed that his subjects loved him as much as he loved himself. When reports reached him of criticism in the provinces, he dismissed them as jealousy from inferior minds who couldn't appreciate his vision. It was in this state of delusional confidence that Nero decided to undertake his greatest artistic achievement, a tour of Greece, where he would compete in every major festival and prove once and for all that he was the greatest performer in history. The trip to Greece in 66, 67, 8b was a year-long festival of ego and corruption. Nero competed in every possible event, singing, lyre playing, chariot racing, even acting, and won every single competition he entered. The fix was obvious and shameless. Judges who had spent their lives evaluating talent suddenly discovered that a mediocre Roman emperor was the greatest artist they had ever seen. In one famous incident at the Olympic Games, Nero was thrown from his chariot and failed to finish the race, yet was still declared the winner. The judges, presumably fearing for their lives, ruled that his intentions had been so noble that he deserved the victory despite his failure to complete the course. Nero collected over 1,800 first-place crowns during his Greek tour. Than any performer in history, he returned to Rome in triumph, parading through the streets in the same chariot that Augustus had used for his greatest military victories. But instead of celebrating conquered enemies, Nero was celebrating his victories over singers and actors, treating artistic competitions as if they were military campaigns. The Roman people watched this spectacle with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. Their emperor, who should have been governing an empire, had spent a year playing dress-up in foreign theaters. Worse, he had bankrupted the treasury to pay for his extended vacation, forcing new taxes on an already struggling population. But the real crisis was brewing in the provinces, where governors and generals were beginning to question whether Rome could survive much more of Nero's leadership. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised the banner of revolt, declaring that the empire needed a new emperor. In Spain, Galba began assembling an army. Even in Africa, normally peaceful provinces started showing signs of unrest. The news of these rebellions reached Nero while he was still basking in the glory of his artistic triumphs. His first reaction was not concern, but excitement. Here was an opportunity for more drama, more spectacle, more chances to demonstrate his artistic vision on a grander stage. He began planning elaborate revenge fantasies, imagining how he would punish the rebels with theatrical executions and poetic justice. He commissioned songs about his future victories and designed costumes for his triumphal returns. In his mind, these revolts were not threats to his power, but opportunities to create the greatest show in history. But as more reports arrived from the provinces, even Nero began to realize that something was seriously wrong. The revolt was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and Galba was marching toward Rome with a professional army. For the first time in his reign, the emperor faced a real military threat from a competent general with nothing to lose. Nero's response revealed just how completely disconnected he had become from reality. Instead of rallying his forces or negotiating with the rebels, he began planning a theatrical tour of Egypt, where he believed his artistic talents would be better appreciated. He sent messages to provincial governors explaining that he was temporarily unavailable due to pressing artistic commitments, but would deal with the rebellion when his schedule permitted. Meanwhile, the situation in Rome was deteriorating rapidly. The Praetorian Guard, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began making secret contact with Galba's representatives. Senators who had spent years in terrified silence started meeting in private to discuss alternatives to Nero's rule. Even the common people, who had initially been entertained by the emperor's spectacles, were growing tired of his antics. The end came suddenly, as it often does for tyrants who believe themselves invincible. On June 8, 68 AD, Nero awoke to find that the Praetorian Guard had abandoned him during the night. The Senate had declared him a public enemy and sentenced him to death by flogging, a punishment so degrading that it was usually reserved for the lowest criminals. For the first time in his life, Nero found himself truly alone. His bodyguards were gone, his supporters had melted away, and even his slaves were beginning to slip out of the palace under cover of darkness. The man who had commanded the loyalty of millions through fear and violence discovered that terror was a brittle foundation for power. In his final hours, Nero's true character was revealed not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through petty, pathetic displays of cowardice and self-pity. He wandered through his empty palace, alternately weeping and raging, calling for Sporus to comfort him in his distress. The castrated boy, still dressed in women's clothing, still playing the role of empress to a fallen emperor, was perhaps the only being in Rome who couldn't abandon him. As news arrived that Galba's forces were approaching the city, Nero finally understood that his reign was over. But even then, he couldn't face reality with dignity. Instead of making a stand or negotiating surrender, he decided to flee Rome and throw himself on the mercy of the Parthians, Rome's greatest enemies. The plan was as cowardly as it was unrealistic. Nero would sneak out of the city at night, make his way to the coast, and sail to the Eastern Empire, where he imagined the Parthian king would welcome him as a fellow artist and patron of the arts. In his delusional mind, he saw himself living in exotic luxury, performing for appreciative foreign audiences while Rome burned behind him. But when Nero tried to recruit accomplices for his escape, he discovered that his reign of terror had left him without a single genuine ally. Former friends refused to see him, loyal servants claimed illness, and even his hired musicians declined to accompany him on his journey. The emperor, who had surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants, found that fair-weather loyalty evaporated the moment it was truly needed. With dawn approaching and Galba's army drawing closer, Nero made a final, desperate decision. He would flee to the villa of his freedman Finn, about 4 miles outside the city, and hide there while he planned his next move. It was a pathetic end for a man who had once commanded legions, sneaking out of his own capital like a common criminal, reduced to begging shelter from a former slave. The journey to Finn's villa was a humiliating odyssey through the Roman countryside. Nero, who had spent his life being carried in golden litters and riding in jeweled chariots, found himself on foot in the pre-dawn darkness, stumbling through fields and olive groves while trying to avoid the roads where his pursuers might spot him. He had covered his face with a cloak and was accompanied only by 4 faithful companions: Finn, the freedman; Epaphroditus, his secretary; Neophytus, his valet; and Sporicide, dressed as a woman, still playing his assigned role even as the world collapsed around them. This strange procession: a fallen emperor, 3 servants, and a castrated boy in drag made its way through the Roman countryside like a grotesque parody of imperial dignity. When they finally reached Finn's villa, Nero's companions had to dig a tunnel under the building's foundation because the emperor was too frightened to approach the front door. He crawled through this makeshift burrow on his hands and knees, emerging into a small basement room where he would spend his final hours cowering like a trapped animal. The villa was humble by imperial standards. A few small rooms, simple furnishings, none of the luxury that Nero had known throughout his life. For a man who had lived in palaces covered with gold and precious stones, who had dined off silver plates and drunk from jeweled cups, the stark simplicity of Finn's home must have seemed like another world entirely. But it was here, in this unremarkable building, that the most powerful man on earth would meet his end, in that cramped basement. As the first light of June 9th filtered through the dirty windows, Nero finally confronted the reality he had spent his entire life avoiding. He was utterly, completely alone. The companions who had followed him into exile huddled in the corners, no longer the obsequious courtiers who had once hung on his every word, but frightened men, wondering if they would survive their association with a fallen tyrant. Sporus sat, silent in his woman's robes, the cosmetics on his face streaked with tears, perhaps mourning not for Nero, but for his own uncertain future, in a world that had no place for what the emperor had made him. As the hours passed, messengers began arriving, with increasingly dire news. Galba's army was already inside Rome. The Senate had not only confirmed Nero's death sentence, but had ordered that he be dragged naked through the streets, flogged with rods until dead, and then thrown into the Tiber River like a common criminal. The Praetorian Guard was actively hunting for him, eager to deliver his head to the new emperor and prove their loyalty to the winning side. But perhaps the most crushing blow came when a courier arrived with news from the palace. Nero's servants were looting his private quarters, carrying off golden statues, precious artworks, and even his collection of theatrical costumes. The slaves who had once trembled at his footstep were now fighting over his possessions like scavengers picking at a corpse. When Nero heard this final humiliation, something inside him finally broke. The man who had commanded the worship of millions, who had forced senators to kneel before his golden statue, who had believed himself to be a god among mortals, collapsed to his knees on the dirt floor of a freedman's basement and wept like a lost child. "They're stealing my things," he sobbed, his voice cracking with the same weakness he had once mocked in his victims. "My beautiful things, my costumes, my lyres." The emperor who had murdered his mother, his wives, his rivals, and countless innocence was reduced to tears over material possessions, unable to comprehend that his crimes had consequences beyond the loss of pretty objects. As morning wore on, the sound of horses could be heard in the distance, search parties combing the countryside, drawing ever closer to Finn's villa. Nero's remaining companions began to exchange meaningful glances, calculating whether their chances were better if they stayed with the emperor or abandoned him to save themselves. It was then that Epaphroditus, his secretary, spoke the words that would finally force Nero to face his fate. "Caesar, you must act now. They will be here within the hour, and what they will do to you will be far worse than anything you have done to others. Remember Marcus Crassus. Remember how the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat. Remember every torture you have ordered, every creative death you have devised. They will show you no mercy." The reminder of his own cruelty had the intended effect. Nero's sobs turned to panic as he imagined himself subjected to the same torments he had inflicted on others. He thought of the Christians he had burned alive, their screams echoing through his gardens. He remembered the way Octavia's blood had pooled on her prison floor. He pictured the expression on Agrippina's face as the swords pierced her flesh. For the first time, the monster understood what it felt like to be prey. "I cannot die like this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not like a common criminal, not dragged through the streets for their amusement. I am Caesar. I am descended from the divine Augustus. I am an artist, a poet, a performer who has brought beauty into the world." Even now, even in this moment of ultimate defeat, Nero's narcissism remained intact. He could not see himself as others saw him as, a murderous tyrant whose death would be celebrated throughout the empire. In his mind, he was a misunderstood genius, a victim of lesser minds who couldn't appreciate his vision. Finn, who had known Nero for years and understood his psychology better than most, knelt beside his former master and spoke with surprising gentleness. "Then die as Caesar should die. Choose your own manner of death. Show them that you still have the courage of your ancestors." The suggestion of suicide had been hanging in the air since their arrival at the villa, but none had dared speak it aloud until now. Roman tradition held that a noble death by one's own hand was preferable to execution by enemies, that a man who chose his moment of departure retained a measure of dignity that could not be taken from him. But Nero had never shown physical courage in his entire life. Every murder he had ordered had been carried out by others. Every enemy he had destroyed had been eliminated through poison, treachery, or hired assassins. The idea of driving a blade into his own flesh, of feeling steel pierce his skin and organs, filled him with revulsion. "I cannot," he said, his voice rising to a whine. "You don't understand. My hands, they are artists, hands meant for creating beauty, not for violence. I have never harmed anyone personally. I am not a warrior or a gladiator. I am a performer, a musician, a poet. The delusion was breathtaking. Here was a man responsible for thousands of deaths, including the murder of his own mother, claiming that he had never harmed anyone. His inability to distinguish between ordering killings and carrying them out himself revealed the profound disconnect between Nero's self-image and reality. Epaphroditus, his valet, tried a different approach. Caesar, remember your performances. On stage, think of this as your greatest role, the noble Roman choosing death over dishonor. The audience will remember how you exit the stage. Make it memorable. For a moment, Nero's eyes lit up with something approaching enthusiasm. The idea of death as performance, as a final artistic statement, appealed to his twisted sensibilities. He began to pace the small room, gesturing dramatically as he worked out the staging of his own demise. Yes, he said, his voice gaining strength. Yes, this could be magnificent, a noble suicide performed with dignity and style. They will write songs about it. Poets will celebrate my courage. History will remember how Nero chose death over surrender. But as he continued planning his performance, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. The search parties were closing in, and time was running out. His companions urged him to act quickly, but Nero seemed paralyzed by indecision, unable to bridge the gap between theatrical fantasy and brutal reality. It was then that a messenger burst into the room with the most terrifying news yet. The pursuers had found their trail and were only minutes away. Already, soldiers could be seen in the distance, their armor glinting in the morning sun as they rode toward the villa. The moment of decision had arrived, and Nero finally understood that all his preparations, all his dramatic speeches and artistic visions, meant nothing if he lacked the courage to act. With trembling hands, he picked up a dagger that had placed before him, holding it as if it were a poisonous snake that might bite him. I cannot do this alone, he whispered. Someone must help me. Someone must guide the blade. It was a final act of cowardice from a man whose entire life had been defined by forcing others to do his dirty work. Even in death, even in this most personal of acts, Nero could not take responsibility for his own actions. If you are certain, Caesar, Epaphroditus said softly, I will assist you, but you must be the one to begin. You must show that you choose this path. Nero nodded, tears streaming down his face as he placed the point of the dagger against his throat. His hand shook so violently that he could barely maintain contact between blade and skin. For long seconds, he stood frozen, unable to summon the will to drive the weapon home. Outside, the sound of horses had stopped. Voices could be heard calling to each other as they surrounded the villa. Heavy footsteps approached the building, and the scrape of armor echoed from the main room above their hiding place. Now, Epaphroditus hissed. It must be now, or they will take you alive. With a convulsive movement, Nero drove the dagger into his throat, but his aim was poor and his strength failed him. The blade entered at an angle, missing the major blood vessels and lodging in muscle and tissue. Blood flowed, but not enough to bring quick death, only enough to cause agonizing pain. Nero collapsed to the floor, the dagger still protruding from his neck, making horrible gurgling sounds as blood filled his throat. He tried to speak, but the words came out as incomprehensible. Babble mixed with blood and saliva. The second thrust found its mark, and Nero's blood began to flow in earnest, pooling beneath his head as his life ebbed away. But even as he died, Nero's narcissism remained intact. With his last breath, he managed to gasp out the words that would become his epitaph. Qualis artifacts. Perio, what an artist dies in me. These final words perfectly captured the emperor's delusional self-image. Even as he lay dying in a squalid basement, the victim of his own monstrous cruelty, Nero saw himself not as a tyrant getting his just deserts, but as a misunderstood genius whose death was a loss to all humanity. The irony was devastating. Here was a man who had never created anything beautiful, whose only art had been elaborate tortures and theatrical murders, claiming with his dying breath that the world was losing a great artist. He could not see what everyone else saw clearly, that his death was not a tragedy, but a liberation. As Nero's eyes glazed over and his breathing stopped, the sound of splintering wood came from above. The soldiers had broken down the door and were searching the villa room by room. Within minutes, they would discover the tunnel and find the emperor's body. Sporus, still dressed in his feminine robes, knelt beside the corpse of the man who had destroyed his life and made him into a living symbol of imperial depravity. What thoughts passed through the boy's mind as he looked upon his tormentor's remains? Relief, terror, perhaps just numbness after years of unimaginable abuse. The soldiers found them moments later, their torches illuminating the grotesque scene. In the basement, a dead emperor lying in his own blood, surrounded by his frightened accomplices and the castrated boy he had forced to become his wife. The contrast between the imperial pretensions and the squalid reality could not have been more stark. When news of Nero's death reached Rome, the reaction was not the grief one might expect for a fallen Caesar, but explosive celebration. Citizens poured into the streets, dancing and singing, placing flowers on statues of his victims and defacing every image of the dead emperor they could find. The nightmare was over, and the Roman people could finally express the hatred they had been forced to hide for 14 years. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the empire's provinces, where Nero's death was greeted with such joy that spontaneous festivals broke out across the Mediterranean world. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, the news that the monster was dead prompted celebrations that lasted for days. Never had the death of a Roman emperor been so universally welcomed. The Senate moved quickly to damn Nero's memory, ordering that his name be chiseled from public monuments, his statues melted down, and his image removed from coins. They wanted to erase every trace of his existence, to pretend that the Roman Empire had never been ruled by such a creature. Yet their efforts at historical censorship could not erase the memory of what Nero had done or the lessons his reign taught about the corruption of absolute power. His crimes were too numerous, too shocking, too well documented to simply disappear from the historical record. The Domus Aurea, his golden palace built on the ashes of Rome, was systematically destroyed by subsequent emperors who filled in its rooms with concrete and built public baths and amphitheaters on its ruins. Where Nero had once planned to house his artistic genius, the Colosseum would rise a monument to public entertainment rather than imperial ego. Sporus, the castrated boy who had been forced to play the role of empress, faced an uncertain future. In the new regime, some sources suggest he was initially protected by Otho, who briefly succeeded Galba as emperor, but his ultimate fate remains unknown. Perhaps he simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of the Roman underworld, finally free from the role that had been forced upon him. The historical sources that recorded Nero's life and death, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, wrote with barely concealed disgust about the emperor's crimes, yet even they seemed to struggle with the sheer scope of his depravity, as if human language lacked adequate words to describe what he had become. Tacitus wrote that that Nero had left no abomination in reserve, while Suetonius catalogued his crimes with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. These historians understood that they were recording not just the fall of an emperor, but the story of how civilization itself could be corrupted by unchecked power. The legacy of Nero's reign extended far beyond his personal crimes. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line that had ruled Rome since Augustus. The year of the 4 emperors that followed, with Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian claiming the throne in rapid succession, demonstrated the chaos that could result when imperial authority collapsed. More fundamentally, examples served as a warning about the dangers of absolute power. The Roman system of government, which had originally been designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much authority, had evolved into an empire where one man's whims could determine the fate of millions. Nero's reign revealed the logical endpoint of such a system, a world where the most powerful person was also the most morally corrupt. The parallels to modern tyrannies are unavoidable and unsettling. Like Nero, many dictators throughout history have combined grandiose self-image with stunning cruelty, convinced themselves that their crimes were justified by their supposed genius, and surrounded themselves with sycophants who enabled their worst impulses. The emperor, who demanded to be worshipped as a god, died alone in a basement, abandoned by everyone except the victims he had created. The man who had commanded the loyalty of legions through terror found that fear was no substitute for genuine respect. The artist who claimed to be creating beauty for eternity left behind only a legacy of pain and destruction. Perhaps most damning of all, Nero's final words revealed that he had learned nothing from his experiences. Even as he died, he remained convinced that he was a misunderstood genius rather than a monster who had gotten what he deserved. His inability to see himself clearly, to understand the true nature of his crimes, made his downfall complete. The death of Nero stands as one of history's most perfect examples of poetic justice. The man who had lived by violence and cruelty died in terror and pain. The emperor who had forced others to perform for his amusement ended his life with a theatrical suicide that fooled no one. The tyrant who had demanded worship from his subjects was abandoned to die like a common criminal in the end. Nero's reign serves as a reminder that even the most absolute power is ultimately temporary, that cruelty and oppression contain the seeds of their own destruction, and that history has a way of delivering justice to those who believe themselves above its reach. The last Julio-Claudian emperor had promised the Roman people that he would rule with mercy and wisdom. Instead, he gave them 14 years of murder, depravity, and madness. His death in that squalid basement, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, was not a tragedy, but a liberation, the end of a nightmare that had lasted far too long. The monster was finally dead, and the world could begin to heal from the wounds he had inflicted. But the memory of what he had done and what he had become would echo through history as a warning about the darkness that lurks within. Unchecked power and the terrible price that civilization pays when that darkness is allowed to flourish. As his blood soaked into the dirt floor of Finn's villa, Nero's reign of terror came to its inevitable end, not with the grand artistic gesture he had imagined, but with the pathetic whimper of a coward who had finally run out of victims to blame for his own monstrous choices.